of the sessions themselves, I would approach this from the perspective of curiosity and wonder, and how we can use some of the amazing things in nature, and it's very easy to do, as I hope you'll see and I hope you'll agree, in the deep sea, to inspire others, to inspire curiosity and the pursuit of science. And so I'm going to touch on how we do science in the deep sea, what my lab does. I'll only have a little bit of data, instead give you a broader picture of it, and then talk about some of the technology. I know we have engineers and so on who might be interested in some of the technology that we're using. And then finally, an opportunity for you to participate in deep sea exploration live right now, not right this second, listen to me, but maybe later this weekend or next week. So, oh, I have too many devices here in front of me. So for me, curiosity and wonder that drew me to science fully bloomed when I was an undergraduate. I was a fine arts major, actually, and I learned about hydrothermal vents. And we're looking at a couple of videos of hydrothermal vents right here. And these are these strange environments that are belching this superheated water. They have these otherworldly looking life forms. And I was told that these were on the bottom of our own ocean. I'm like, really? On this planet, these things look so alien. These habitats look so alien. And I decided I had to see that with my own eyes. And this inspired me to first become a scientist, and more specifically to become a deep sea biologist. Sorry, the multiple tools here. So I'm a deep sea biologist, and it's kind of surprising how few people know about, or as this cartoon suggests, even care about the bottom of the ocean and the deep sea. And I think this stems from a lack of knowledge. But this evening, I'm going to try to convince you that the deep sea is interesting, it's beautiful even, and that it's relevant and worthy of study. And using the newer technologies that we have, we are not only learning more and more about the deep sea, but we're able to expose the general public to the deep sea and take the general public into the deep with scientists as we explore it. And so that's an important perspective on this. So where we have to start is with our planet, sort of a zoomed out view here. We all know that the planet is mostly ocean. We have this great quote from Arthur Clarke that we should call the planet ocean. The ocean covers 70% of the planet. But what you may not realize is that the deep ocean constitutes most of the ocean's volume, as well as most of the ocean's living space. Over 95% of the habitable Earth is in the deep sea. That's quite remarkable. And another remarkable aspect of that is that only 95%, or excuse me, only 5% or less than 5% of that deep ocean has actually been explored. So there's a lot of it that we don't know about. I found this really cool graphic at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. You can check it out, #KnowYourOcean. And it's pointing out that there have been more people on the moon than in the deepest part of the ocean. And they've spent more than 100 hours more on the surface of the moon than we have in the deepest part of the ocean. So it gives a good indication that the deep sea is really underexplored. All right, so in order for me to convince you that it's interesting, we really need to know what it is that we're talking about. So the first thing I want to talk about is what scientists mean when they refer to the deep sea. It's actually a very specific thing, and not just sort of this sort of hand waving, oh, it's deep water. So how deep? So it's college. We're going to have a quiz, one more before the weekend. And so I'd like you all to try this. And I want to find out from you, how deep do you think the ocean is? And so I'm actually going to try to call up a poll, but I can't seem to get to it. But here's my question. I want to know, what is the average depth of the ocean? Oh, there we go. Thank you, Sherry. So feel free to take a guess. And I just want you to give your gut guess on this. It doesn't matter, how well you know it, but just let us know what you think. We'll do it for about 20, 25 seconds. And part of the point here is that very few people have a good sense of the ocean on our planet and how deep it is. Maybe this audience is a little bit different, college students. Some of you may already be interested in marine biology and so on. And so we will see. And again, I'm talking about the average depth. There's a few ringers in the audience, I know. my own grad students, for example. Hopefully they're getting the answer right. And so I think we can stop that. Sherry will end the poll there. And so let's see, it looks like most of you guessed about 6,320 meters, then 3,682 meters, and then a couple of you said, or a few of you said 10,994 meters. Well, some of those numbers were just my office phone number for me just to throw in to throw you off. The 250, the 200, that's going to come back, and we'll see why that's critical. The average depth is actually 3,682 meters. Move that poll. And then the 10,994 is the deepest part of the ocean. So this is what I was referring to in that last slide about only 3 people have visited that depth. All right, so very often I'm telling people that this is the average depth of the ocean, and still it's a little bit hard to wrap your head around. Maybe I should have pointed out before you were doing the guesses that 1 meter is 3 feet. So if you wanted to make that calculation for yourself, but let's put it into a context perhaps that is more familiar to us here in Lafayette, and that is with the Cajun Dome. So if you're inside the Cajun Dome, it's approximately 50 meters from the floor to the ceiling. And so the average depth of the ocean would be 74 Cajun domes piled on top of one another. Perhaps you're a world traveler, so you've been to Dubai. You can look at it in terms of the world's tallest building. So about 4.5 of the world's tallest buildings stacked on top of each other would get us to the average depth of the ocean. Now that's just the average. So the total depth of the ocean, I can't actually represent on this slide. It's 220 Cajun domes. I got about 200 here. So we're going to keep that. We're going to go back to that in just a second. So the ocean is deep. But what I was saying before is that the ocean is deep, and most of the habitable part of the Earth is in that deep ocean. And so we still haven't defined what do we mean by the deep sea. So when scientists talk about the deep sea, we're talking at a depth of about 200 meters and deeper. And there are some reasons for that. I'll just give you one example. And that is if you look at the edge of the continents, where the continents drop off into the very deep part of the ocean, the edge of the continent is under the water. The average depth at where it changes into the slope is about 200 meters. There's some other important aspects there. For example, temperature and the amount of light, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. So scientists agree that the definition of the deep sea is 200 meters and deeper. So if we go back to this image, you see that in terms of the total ocean, only a very small slice of it is not deep sea, and that is just that upper layer, whereas by far the vastness of it is deep sea, and the volume is also extremely deep. So we've established that we have a definition for the deep sea. By far, most of the planet can be classified as deep sea, and it's the most common habitat on the planet, but it's also one of the least explored on the planet. All right, so what does it mean to have a habitat that starts at 200 meters and goes down to almost 11 kilometers deep? Well, there's certain characteristics, certain ecological and environmental characteristics that affect the animals that live there. And the first is that the deep sea is dark. And this is because as the sun's waves go into the water, they're scattered, they're absorbed, and basically by about 150 to 200 meters, there's no longer enough light to support photosynthesis, and that gets important in just a moment. And then virtually all of the light is gone by about 1,000 meters. Between about 200 meters and 1,000 meters, there's still a little bit of light such that some animals that have sufficiently developed eyes may be able to use it for vision, but certainly not for photosynthesis. But once you're below 1,000 meters, there's no light. It's completely dark. And again, the average depth of the ocean is 3,600. So that means that most of the ocean is dark. Another thing is that it is cold, and that is because it is the sunlight that heats up the water. And if the sunlight is extinguished in the upper part of the water column, then when you get deeper, there's basically no heat input. And so it's very cold. And so you can see here that most of the ocean, the bulk of the ocean, is as cold or colder than your refrigerator and approaching freezing conditions. So about 4 degrees to -1 degree Celsius. The ocean is also, or the deep ocean is also under very high pressure. So when you stand at sea level, you feel the weight of the atmosphere on you. And, this is the way we've lived since the day we were born. So don't really notice it. But when you jump into the water, you jump into a pool, you start to feel it on your sinuses that that water is heavy, there's pressure that's exerted. Well, for every 10 meters of depth that you go down, that atmospheric pressure basically doubles. And so you can see that by the time you get to the bottom of the ocean, there's an extremely high pressure. Basically, it's 100 times the atmospheric pressure. And at the depths that we do a lot of our work on, we say that the equivalent would be an elephant on every square inch of your body. Just a note here in this little infographic, it's kind of fun. It shows here the average cruising altitude for a commercial airliner. So inverse, the ocean is deeper than where planes are typically flying up in the sky. So, when you look at the plane next time, you get a sense that the ocean is even deeper than that plane is high. All right, so the last characteristic that we'll discuss here is that the deep sea is food poor. And this has to do, again, with the sunlight. So in this graphic, what we're looking at is a section through the ocean, going from the surface of the ocean down to the floor of the ocean. And all these little dots are meant to represent biological or organic carbon, either in the form of phytoplankton, those microscopic plants that can absorb energy from the sun and undergo photosynthesis, incorporate that into their organic carbon, into their tissue, and they serve as food for zooplankton and fish and so on. Or the particles may be broken up cells, fecal material that still has organic carbon in it, cells and organisms that have died and so on. And what you can see is that there's a lot more of this organic material up near the surface of the water. And that's because that's where the sun is and that's where the production is. That's our primary production. And as you get deeper, there's no sun, so there's no new primary production. There actually is a little bit chemosynthesis, but we don't have time to talk about that. But it's a very minor component compared to all the production from the photosynthesis. And so that means for any animal that's living in the deep sea, the way that it gets its food is by material that is sinking through the water column down to the deep. Now, there's organisms that are living throughout the water column, and they're going to be getting their bit, feeding on as much as they can. And so the deeper you go, the less food is available because it's being removed in the water column as it's sinking. And so at the greatest depths, you find the least amount of food. The deeper you go, the less food is available. And you can see here this statistic that only about 3% of the carbon that's produced at the surface ever makes it to the deep sea floor. So the deep sea is food poor, and that means that animals that live in the deep sea have to have adaptations for dealing with those conditions. All right, so I just named 4 different conditions that are relatively extreme compared to the conditions that we are familiar with. That is, there's no light, it's very cold, there's extremely high pressures, and there's very little food. So given those extreme environmental conditions, the question is, can life even exist in the deep sea? And the initial answer to that question was no. And this was based on some studies that were done by Edward Forbes. He basically was using a dredge in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. And this was in the mid-19th century, so 1860s, I think it was. And when he put his dredge down into the water and brought it up, he found that there were fewer and fewer plants and animals the deeper that he sampled. And he went down to about 480 meters, so only to about this depth did he sample. But from those data that he collected, he did an extrapolation. And his extrapolation, he proposed what was called the azoic hypothesis. And that would be that life is extinguished when you get to the greatest depths of the ocean. Now, he was wrong. And one of the reasons he was wrong is because I wouldn't be giving a seminar on deep sea biology. But it took about 25 years for that hypothesis to be refuted, even though people were finding contrary evidence to that hypothesis along the way. So things like bringing up telephone cables that had been put on the ocean floor, they would find that there were animals that were living on them, but the cables themselves were more than 1,000 meters deep, more than a kilometer deep. So that didn't square with this azoic hypothesis. But what's interesting is that it tells you something about scientists, and that is that we're human, and sometimes even despite evidence to the contrary, it's hard to give up a favored hypothesis. We felt that these environmental conditions were so severe that it makes total sense what Forbes said, and so we agree, yeah, there's probably not going to be life there. But finally, enough evidence accumulated that they had to overlook that. Not overlook it, but re-examine those assumptions. And then there were a whole series of expeditions that were set up to test how deep can animals live, because now we know that there are animals there. This is also in part a story about technology, so it's a good start for what I'm going to present to you a little bit later. And that is that Forbes actually interpreted the data that he had correctly. However, the gear that he was using was not appropriate to the question. That is, he was using a net, and that net had basically a mesh size that was too big for the kind of organisms that you see in the deep sea. Recall I said that the deeper you go, the less and less food there is. And on average, the deeper you go, the smaller and smaller organisms get. And that's one way of adapting to the low amount of food input. And so he should have had a net that had a smaller mesh. The other problem that he didn't know of at the time is that the Eastern Mediterranean actually has very low densities of deep sea animals. So if there's a place you're going to go to study, how much life is there in the deep sea, that was a poor choice to make, but they didn't know that at the time. So I said that there are a whole series of expeditions that came about in the late 1800s and going up into the 1950s with the Danish Galathea expedition. And these showed that basically at all depths of the ocean, we can find life. And so that was a pretty profound thing. Despite the harsh conditions as we interpret them, organisms, life finds a way. And so this is just some examples of during that expedition, the deepest records that they were able to show for some of these organisms. Now, some of you may fairly say, you're not interested in the same sort of biology that I am, that, well, that's just a little bunch of bugs that live in the mud. And so what I want to show you now is a short video that shows you some of the spectacular stuff that you can see when you have the appropriate technology and not just these nets and dredges. So we'll play about 3 minutes of this. Okay, so hopefully what you can see from there is that the deep sea is indeed diverse. It's also full of color. There are organisms moving around. It's not just all little stuff in the mud. There are large organisms and so on. And there's a little bit also in there that is a preview of what I'll talk about in a few minutes about the technology that we use to see that sort of stuff. So this leads to a bit of the science that I do, and so we'll just present this from a little bit, just for a little bit. And my interest as a scientist in terms of the deep sea is basically where does all that diversity come from? What's the evolutionary history of that? And then furthermore, where are those things distributed? Or do we find deep sea species found in all oceans, or are they more geographically restricted to one ocean or one feature on a bottom? So why are there so many species? How are there so many species? What is the origin of those species? Did they come from shallow water into the deep, or have they evolved in the deep sea? And then what sort of species are down there? So in order to do that, my students and I will collect these corals in the deep sea, and then basically we're going to examine the DNA. And this is where a lot of the undergraduate student research in my lab takes place. It's these next few steps that I'm going to tell you about. So one of the modern ways to look at evolutionary history of organisms is to get their DNA, and this is basically through an organic extraction. So you start with the tissue and you end up with purified DNA. And then the next step in our lab would be to take that purified DNA, undergo a PCR reaction, which is a chemical reaction, an enzymatic reaction that basically amplifies the number of copies of that DNA, such that you can then obtain its DNA sequencing through a variety of techniques. The most common one that we're using is this fluorescent-based technology that gives you a DNA sequence readout. I should point out, given the times right now, this is basically the same sort of PCR and sequencing test that is done to test for COVID, basically taking a sample, seeing if you can amplify the viral DNA in it and sequence it to find out what strain of virus that is. And so, yeah, so this is the sort of thing that the students are doing in my lab. And then what we do with that is use the DNA data to then address these sorts of research questions. So this is the only data slide that I'm going to show you. So if you're freaked out by it, but don't worry too much. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of it and then move on. But ultimately, I'm asking these questions. What is the origin of the deep sea diversity? In this particular case, we're talking about corals, and in particular octocorals. And we want to ask the question, are these shallow water octocorals that have moved into the deep sea? Maybe they've been outcompeted and pushed away, or in the past, did something get into the deep sea and then it has evolved into the lots of the diversity that we see right now? And so what you're looking at over here is called a phylogeny, a phylogenetic tree. And each of these boxes represents a different species that was used. Basically, we collected a piece of that coral, we got its DNA, we did this analysis. And the way you look at these trees is to look at which groups of species are clustered together. And so, for example, in this little cluster, we would say that these species have a common ancestor at this point, more recent than they do to any of the ones down in this part of the tree. Okay, so we did this analysis and we looked at 103 different species. I should point out there are more than 3,000 species of these octocorals. So this is a small sampling, but it's still a pretty complete sampling. Excuse me. Well, the first question is, well, which of these species are deep sea? And so the blue bars represent the species that live in the deep oceans. And so the first thing that you should note from this and take home from this is that there are deep sea species scattered throughout the tree. And what does that mean scientifically in terms of the research questions that we asked? It means that there's been independent evolution of a deep sea species multiple times in history. So for example, this species right here has as its closest relative a bunch of shallow water species. And this one down here has shallow water species as its closest relatives, and they're not close to each other. And so that means independently, this deep sea species evolved from a likely shallow water ancestor. Now, the one exception to that is down here on this part of the tree, where we have a whole big cluster of deep sea species that all trace back to a single common ancestor. And so this is evidence that, excuse me, sorry. This is evidence that the coral species here, they represent actually 3 different families, likely evolved from a common ancestor that lived itself in the deep sea. And so that's evidence for what we call evolutionary radiation in the deep sea. And so in my lab over the last 15 years, we've been looking at each of these 3 families independently. And I'm showing you some photos of them to show that even at this gross level and not having any experience with corals, you should be able to see that these are very morphologically diverse, both within a family. These are 3 different species of bamboo coral, and between the families, and especially a lot of diversity between the families. And the other thing you can see is that each family has a whole lot of species. So 100 or more species per family. So it's a very diverse group. And so we independently analyzed with a lot more samples than the 9 that you saw in the previous sample, previous slide. I'm going to skip this for time's sake. We independently analyzed each family, and what we found is that in each family, we see evidence of a species radiation and morphological diversification within the deep sea. What that is saying is that in each of these groups that have more than 100 species, sometimes more than 200 species, it seems like the ancestor lived in the deep sea. Furthermore, all 3 of these families trace back to a single ancestor, which gives you even bigger impression that there's been all kinds of diversification, the amount of differentiation morphologically that you see across families, but also that the ancestor to these deep sea taxa has been in the deep ocean for a very long period of time. I mean, hundreds of millions of years. So it may seem like an extreme environment to us, but animals have been living there for a very long period of time, doing fine and diversifying into all the different microhabitats that you find down there. So that's the point of the data that I'm showing you, that little preview of the data that I'm showing you that comes from our lab. All right, so then the next issue that I want to discuss with you a little bit is about how we actually get these samples. So in order to get the DNA to build the phylogeny, we need to get a sample. And preferably what we would like to do is to collect a piece of a coral where we know where the coral is in terms of its ecology. We know how it's related to the other species down there, I mean, spatially, and we don't want to just drag a dredge or a net and smash everything. We'd rather just take a little piece of it. And so we need the technology to do that. And so I'm going to back up and remind you that Forbes was using a net that he dragged down at various depths in the Eastern Mediterranean. And all the way through to the 1960s, that's the major way that biologists, marine biologists have collected things from the deep ocean. And it wasn't until the 60s that we got this submersibles, human occupied vehicle like Alvin. And I had an opportunity as a graduate student to have several dives in Alvin. It was extremely exciting. You get to go into the deep, and with your own eyes, you can now see what that environment is like. It's really valuable. But it wasn't until much later in my career that I realized there is a limitation here. And the limitation is that only 3 of you can fit in that sub. And so any of the observations you make and the decisions you're making about your experiments and observations on the fly can only be shared with those people. Well, now the equipment that I use much more often, and I favor for a whole variety of reasons, is a remotely operated vehicle, or an ROV. This is a vehicle that is much like the submersible in that it's got all the same tools. It's got sampling arms and cameras and so on, but nobody is inside it. Instead, it's operated from the deck of a ship. An advantage is that it doesn't have batteries. The submersible, you can only stay down as long as your batteries are charged, and then you have to come up. So a dive can be relatively short, whereas you can run this around the clock for days. You just have to keep doing shifts of people on the deck of the ship who are operating it. But you can have real-time imagery, which means that there are cameras and you have fiber optics that are transmitting that to the deck of the ship. You can sample in any way. You can be creative to think, what sort of sampling tools can I put on my ROV? The ROV is controlled from the ship operations room, and I just want to sort of quickly point out to you the number of people that are involved in doing this. So we have a pilot who's driving the sub itself. We have a co-pilot in the system here. It's a dual body, so there are two basically ROVs. There's also a navigator. This is a really important person who's coordinating with the pilots and the ship, because you have currents at the surface and winds pushing the ship in one direction, and you have currents subsurface that are moving the ROVs in a different direction. So there's a lot of math and physics that go on into determining how do you move the ship in order to get the ROV in the place that you want it so that the pilot can do his thing. We also have a video engineer who's operating the cameras and controlling all the lights, another video engineer who's doing various real-time clipping, and then a couple of scientists. And we're on the ship, and so anyone else on the ship can also participate in this observation. So the point that I want to make here is we've gone from the 3 people in the sub to all of these people in the control room who are making decisions on how to do the sampling and what to sample and so on. So it's a real benefit in that way. And I'm going to show you even more technology in just a second that will show how that's expanded even more. So this sub can dive down to 6,000 meters, and so it's able to sample most of or much of the deep sea, certainly that average depth, and so it's very capable. All right, so I'm going to show you another little video here now that sort of repeats what I said, but in a much more creative way. So I'm not sure if any of the visual artists are attending this seminar, but I wanted them to see how you could incorporate your ideas and creativity to tell a scientific story.
I read this article once, and this said, imagine that there was an alien race that had come to Earth, but they couldn't actually go into the atmosphere of Earth, and so they would drop a net. And what is that net going to catch? Well, maybe it takes an air conditioner off of a building, and it catches a squirrel, and then it gets a couple of garbage cans. And they bring that up, and that's their impression of what lives on Earth. But they know nothing really about what lives on Earth. In the early days of seagoing, basically all of our knowledge of what was in the deep ocean comes from whatever we can put over the side of a ship and then bring up to the surface of the ship. Well, now technology allows us to bring our eyes into the deep sea.
We have multiple meteorological sensors, a flow-through system to measure salinity and temperature of the seawater. The mast on the ship allow us to have really high resolution navigation data, 2 VSAT satellite domes to have internet. And all of these different sensors provide information in real time to scientists on board. We can provide this data in real time shoreside as well.
And now suddenly, when you go to sea, you're taking all of your science colleagues with you.
I mean, here we are 2,000 miles from the nearest land, and we have rapid and instantaneous communication.
Multi-beam sonar has definitely come a long way. The EM302 and 710 that are on Falkor, instead of 1 beam below the ship, we have 432 beams that allow us to get a much, much larger swath of the sea floor.
And relatively quickly, we can get these just incredible 3D maps that allow us then to make better plans and predictions of what's going to live on the bottom.
Before submarines and ROVs came along, all you could do was drop a trawl or a dredge. Like we sometimes see these whole forests of corals. A trawl would just go through there and remove everything. But with an ROV, we can go down and say, well, we'll take a piece of that, and we'll take a piece of that. You know, that can be extremely selective.
Sebastian has the ability to grab, manipulate, pick up a rock, look underneath it, has a front porch that is adaptable and can put different kind of containment.
In the video systems, and that's really changed our science to the point where we can come close to identifying things while they're sitting on the seafloor. We don't have to collect them.
I was not prepared for it at all. I was not prepared for the magnitude of how amazing the seafloor can be.
There's no question that as technology improves, our ability to ask and answer scientific questions improves.
All right, so that gave a preview to what I want to finish with here just for a couple of minutes. This idea of starting with the 3 people in the sub to the people in the control room, the ship, and then Les Watling there mentioned something about telepresence and basically taking the world with you. And I'm hoping there are some engineers in the audience just to get a sense of the number of different specialties that are required in order to do this. So I'm been working with this NoShip Okeanos Explorer and the Ocean Exploration Program for several years. I'm a science advisor there, and so I want to tell you a little bit about what they do, because it really changes the way that we do science, and they have really changed the way a lot of people think about science. I've got a web address here. I'll have it up a couple of times, but I want to encourage you, if you're interested in any of the amazing visuals that you're seeing, to check out the website, because you can follow basically this live, but you can also download video and images of these various things. So basically, NoShip Okeanos Explorer is a federal vessel that is dedicated to exploring the deep ocean. And the thing that I want to highlight here is that they have really worked on and developed what they call telepresence-enabled research and exploration. And so the reason they can do this is that they beam the video and the audio to a satellite to shore, which immediately goes out onto the internet. And so that anyone with internet access can therefore follow along in real time with these deep sea dives. And we're conducting these dives, well, we try to as much as possible, which is easy, but we try to as much as possible conduct the dives in areas where nobody's ever been before. I say that's easy because I've already told you 95% of the deep ocean has not been explored before. There's also a science chat room, and this is basically a virtual room where the collaborating scientists who have signed up to be part of this expedition can, from their office, be making observations and chatting with each other, and also chatting with the scientists who are on the ship and the pilots who are running the ROV. There's also a teleconference phone line. And so this week, my students and I at UL and VO Hall have been basically doing deep sea dives off the Atlantic coast down as deep as, I think our deepest was almost 4,200 meters this week. And we can be on the phone and we can say, oh, that's a really interesting thing that would be really useful to someone's research, our own research. Can we get a collection? And so the point of that is that we have gone from the 3 people in the sub to the number of people who are on the ship controlling the ROV, to now virtually scientists all over the world. All these experts can be going to sea and collaborating together in real time in order for us to make the most of this exploration. So it's a really exciting tool. And so I'll leave you kind of with this address here. The expedition going on right now is the Windows to the Deep. And so for the most part, they've been working off of Georgia and Florida and South Carolina, although as of today, there's some bad weather that's moving through there. So they're sort of running away, but they're going off towards the Keys, and they may be going into the southeastern Gulf of Mexico. But you can go here and you can follow the dives live and listen along with the rest of us. So that's my presentation. The last thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to open this up for questions if anybody has any, but in the background, I'm going to be playing this video, which if you go to this website, you can watch this video yourself. It's just because it's a summary of the last 10 years of Okeanos Explorer, and it's got some fantastic images. And so even if you have nothing that you're interested in asking me, you can at least be entertained by the awesome video when the talking heads aren't on. But thanks for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.
Wow, we should, there's the applause right there. Awesome. Very nice. So I'm going to give yeah, I see some more clapping hands. It's so different to see clapping hands. You have to see them instead of hear them. It is open for questions if anyone has one. It's just so much, you need to kind of let it sink in for a minute. This is my favorite part though, is to see the animals. They're so
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is why I wanted to put some of these video clips in here. One of the beauties is the quality of the video. They're taking these high definition cameras down there, and they are essentially almost like traveling microscopes. You can get some really detailed imagery. We see all kinds of behaviors that have never been documented before. We learn just incredible amounts, and the scientists are like kids. We are enjoying it as much as everybody else. It's a great tool.
Absolutely.
Ooh, that was scary. And I mean, there's all kinds of other interesting aspects to the ROV and this dual bodied system, and one of the reasons why you get these beautiful stable images is because with this dual body, you don't have to worry about the ship pitching up and down in the water. Maybe those of us on the ship do because we're getting seasick, but it allows us to get these really nice, clear, stable images.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Brown.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. Just you said earlier in the presentation about how, at the very, deepest levels, it's a really inhospitable environment, and yet there's still life down there. And I may have missed it, just like what kind of, I know you said there's a huge diversity of all different kinds of things, but I guess like how deep are we talking that you can find like complex vertebrate life? Versus I know you're studying mostly coral, but things like fish and things like
Sure.
How far down are we going?
Yeah, so that's interesting because there's a group of people who are designing ways to keep pushing and finding the deepest fish. And it's a little bit tricky. Some of the deepest fish, I believe, are called snailfish, and they're quite small. And one of the ways you can find them is by putting out some bait. And there was just a paper out, it was last year or the year before, that pushed that record down. And I believe it is something like 8.8 kilometers. So 8,800 meters. It's in a trench. So, it's in the deepest hadal environment of the ocean. So that's pretty remarkable. So yeah, they're on these dives in the abyssal depths, like at 4,000, 5,000 meters, there are lots of different kinds of fish species that live down there. So the fish have, I shouldn't say no problem, but there are plenty of fish down there. Things like the marine mammals, I think maybe about 1.8 kilometers is as deep as they can go. And the difference with them is that they have air spaces, right? They have lungs like we do. And so the lungs become crushed. Whereas the fish and all these invertebrates are basically filled with water, which is incompressible. And so they can live down there.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that you started out with a fine arts degree and then you transitioned into your marine biology degree. What was the hardest part about the transition, or what were you not expecting when you transitioned into this new field?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a good question. I'd always been interested in science. So, in high school and so on, biology courses and field trips and so on. I should add one other thing, and that is when I went to do my undergrad degree, I had gone to school and I was too immature. And what I found was that I was frustrated. I was like, well, this is just like high school all over again. It's not for me. And so I actually dropped out after my first semester. And I went and I worked for 4.5 years on all kinds of menial labor. I was a maintenance man at a parking lot. I worked in a printing company and a shoe store, all this sort of stuff. And so I was 21 when I went back to college. And at that time, I had experienced the quote unquote real world, and I knew what it was like to work. And so everything I did in school was just like, this is so much fun. I am learning so much stuff. And it was so easy to compete against the students who didn't realize how good they had it. And so what I found is I had a passion for it. So I was willing to spend the time to study it. If there was something that was hard, that's okay. I'm going to use my Sunday and I'm going to figure this out. And what I can't figure out, I'm going to go and talk to the professor about. And so I think it's really about the motivation and being willing to defer gratification to a little bit later. You know, I'll spend time having more fun later on because I'm going to get this life now. And really, that's what I'd say. I didn't find science hard at all. I found it fascinating. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
And you don't have to stay and watch all this. I'll just let it play. And, you know, I realize we've got another session coming up. So feel free to drop off whenever you want.
I do want to ask one quick thing and before we go, and that is when you go down in the subs, can you just briefly describe that experience?
Well, I mean, the first time was just so awesome because I'd thought about the deep sea for so long, and I did get to see a hydrothermal vent. My first dive was to a hydrothermal vent, so that was, you know, tremendously exciting. It's a weird situation because you're in this titanium sphere that's 6 feet in diameter, and there's 3 of you in there with a bunch of computers and, you know, whatever tools you need to operate the submersible. So it's not comfortable. And back when I went, before they have the computers that they have now, and some of the other technology, you couldn't bring anything flammable in there because you don't want to be trapped under the ocean in a, you know, in a fire in this sphere that you're sealed into. You're sealed in so that it maintains atmospheric pressure. And it starts out really hot. We're in the tropics and we're on the deck of the ship sitting in this sealed sphere waiting to get into the water. But then the longer you're in the deep, you know, you saw it's like 4 degrees Celsius. So it's like a refrigerator. You're against this metal sphere. You don't have any seats because they don't want the cushions because they don't want them to catch fire. And so it gets really cold. And then the longer you're in there, you know, you're exhaling. And because it's so cold, your breath is condensing. And so then you're sitting in a puddle of your own air that you've breathed out. And then the other thing is the CO2. So it's sealed. They do have carbon dioxide scrubbers that are trying to remove the carbon dioxide, but it is building up. And the portholes that you're looking at are 6 inches thick. And so, you know, you're sort of straining your head, trying to see out as much as you can. And if you go on an angle, it gets distorted a bit through that 6-inch glass. So the combination of being twisted like that, distorted, and the buildup of carbon dioxide gives you the worst headache the next day and that evening. But it was all worth it. I couldn't wait to get back down because, you know, what a dream. I mean, the number of people who have had the opportunity, that first dive, I went down to 3,900 meters, so almost 4 kilometers deep. And it takes just 2.5 hours just to sink that deep. It was just so cool. And I guess the other fun thing is definitely on the way back up, they just float back up. They don't use any battery power. So it takes another 2.5 hours to come up. The whole time is 9 hours. So I can predict the next question. But anyway, they play music. So the pilots play some cool, whatever music that you want. So that was fun too.
Very cool. Thank you. All right. Well, do we have any more questions? Well, I'm going to thank all of you.